It totally makes sense to eat a big cake covered in frosting on our birthday. Yum! But blowing out candles? That seems strange and unsanitary. So what's the deal? Why do we blow out candles on our birthday? Let's find out on today's episode of
Colossal Questions.
Just like most other traditions, putting candles on birthday cakes is a ritual that dates back thousands of years at least. No one can say for sure who put candles on cakes for the first time. Tons of ancient civilizations believed that smoke carried their hopes and prayers up through the skies into the heavens, which might be the origin of our modern-day birthday candles. After all, most of us make a wish when we blow them out. Around the time of ancient Greece, this ancient custom started to morph into a way to celebrate. People would put candles on cakes and light them as a tribute to Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt. The moon was a symbol of Aramis, so the cakes were cut into circles to represent the moon, and the candles were lit to make the moon glow. Now the cake and candle tradition is starting to look more familiar. Other scholars believe that the modern-day birthday cake and candle tradition may have actually started in Germany around the mid-1700s, 1746 to be exact. That year, a guy named Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf celebrated his 46th birthday in style. He had a lavish party, complete with a colossal cake covered in candles, one to represent each year, just like we do at birthday parties today. Von Zinzendorf didn't just come up with the idea out of thin air. Germans have been putting candles on cakes for generations, usually one large candle in the middle to symbolize the light of life. He was also playing off an old German festival of Kinderfest, a big party that was kind of like a birthday for all the kids in town. They would have cake topped with lots of candles, and the kids would get together, play games, sing songs, and, well, have a party. So, Count Ludwig was far from the first German to celebrate a birthday with the cake and candles, but he may have been one of the first to make it fashionable for the rich and famous. After all, cake was expensive and hard to make in those days, and not something the average person could just run out and buy on their birthday. But for the rich, it was becoming a yummy way to show off just how fancy they were. Eventually, the Industrial Revolution made it much easier for the average person to afford a cake, and we've been blowing out candles and stuffing our face with cake on our birthdays ever since. So, why do we blow out candles on our birthday? Because even as our world gets more and more digitized, we still have plenty of traditions that we've held for thousands and thousands of years. And that's a hard habit to kick. To this day, people all around the world still like to celebrate their birthdays with a party, cake, candles, maybe a song, and a wish, if they can manage to blow out all the candles in one breath. If you've ever seen a movie on the big screen, you know there's one snack that's more popular than any other: popcorn. But why? Why do we always eat popcorn at the movies? Let's find out on today's episode of
Colossal Questions.
Back before the big screen was invented, popcorn was a popular snack at carnivals and fairgrounds around the United States. By the late 1800s, the popcorn making machine was invented, and it became even easier to make and sell the stuff. Popcorn was super cheap and super popular, but it wasn't exactly fancy. So when the first movie theaters opened around 1900, they wanted nothing to do with the delicious salty snack. You see, movie theaters were seen as a newfangled version of the classic theater, which has a distinctly fancy feel to it. No normal theater would ever allow such a loud and messy food into its performances, so movie theater owners did the same. But all that changed in 1927, when the very first films with sound, called talkies, came out. Now, movies were no longer trying to mimic the sophisticated theater experience and became popular entertainment for everyone. So movie theaters changed their whole vibe. Instead of trying to be fancy like the traditional theater, movie theaters became cheap and easy entertainment for people rich and poor, and popular popcorn was the perfect inexpensive food to go with a film. Early theaters didn't have the space to add popcorn concession stands, so street vendors quickly started posting up outside theaters. After a few years, some vendors started paying a fee to theaters to sell their popcorn right in the lobby to catch the crowds as people entered a movie. Eventually, the theater owners realized they could cut out the middleman and sell popcorn themselves. Popcorn became a must-have for any movie theater. It was so popular that theaters who didn't sell it had trouble attracting moviegoers. But the relationship between popcorn and the movies was really set in stone during World War II. Things like chocolate and sugar were rationed during the war, which made it hard to get candy. But salt and popcorn kernels were never rationed, so the country's favorite movie theater treat was even more available and even more popular. Ever since, popcorn and movies have continued to be as iconic as any duo out there. The only difference? Those buckets keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I'm okay with it. Every Christmas, lucky kids all across the world wake up to a big batch of Christmas gifts. But why? Why do people give gifts on Christmas, and when did it start? Let's find out on today's episode of
Colossal Questions.
People have been giving each other gifts as long as we've had gifts to give. But in order to track the origins of Christmas gifts specifically, we have to head back to ancient Rome. You see, the Romans had a holiday called Saturnalia that took place each December. They would celebrate with carnivals, parties, feasts, and small gifts. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, gift-giving around the winter holidays morphed into a Christmas custom too. Stories like the Three Wise Men and St. Nicholas slowly helped cement gift-giving as a regular part of the Christmas holiday. But there was one big snag along the way in the 1600s, when people in what would eventually be the United States outlawed Christmas for 22 years. Yup, you heard that right. All Christmas activities, including dancing, plays, games, Christmas carols, cheerful celebration, and gifts, were banned by the English government in 1644. And 15 years later, Boston and New England did the same. You see, some people in power felt that Christmas actually wasn't religious enough and focused too much on food, drinks, loud music, and rowdy partying in the streets. Luckily, it didn't last, and by the 1800s, Christmas, and yes, Christmas gifts, were back for good. So this Christmas morning, if you don't open exactly the gift you wanted, just remember, it could be a lot worse. One of the first things we tend to do when we meet someone new is shake hands. But why? When did we start shaking hands as a basic greeting? Let's find out on today's episode of
Colossal Questions.
It probably seems like people have been shaking hands to say hello forever, and in some ways they have. Archaeologists have uncovered depictions of handshakes on vases, graves, stone slabs, statues, paintings, and all sorts of ancient art. But that classic greeting wasn't used in quite the same way we use it today. You see, for most of history, the handshake was mainly used to seal a pact or swear an oath rather than as a casual greeting. Some believe it could have started as a sign of peace between enemies or rivals. After all, clasping someone's hand or wrist is a half-decent way to prove that you aren't carrying some kind of a concealed weapon up your sleeve. According to experts, it wasn't until the mid-1800s that people actually started shaking hands to say hello. And even back then, it was considered a little too casual a greeting, meant just for close, casual friends, kind of like the 19th century equivalent of a fist bump. So, if the handshake we know and love today was finally a fairly common greeting by the 1800s, then who actually started shaking hands to say hello? Well, no one can say for sure, but the Quakers are often given credit. Quakers were a religious group who left Britain for America in the 1600s, believing the Church of England had become too materialistic for its own good. Back in England, a bow, curtsy, salute, and all other forms of saying hello were common and expected when greeting a powerful person. The Quakers believed that everyone was equal and decided they needed a new greeting that anyone could use, regardless of their wealth or influence. Scientists can't say for sure exactly why the handshake stuck around, but there is one theory that it might have something to do with smell. You see, a handshake may actually be a way for us to reflexively sniff for subtle smells on other people, since it forces you to touch and get near each other. Think of it a bit like dogs sniffing each other when they first meet. Every person gives off chemical signals in the form of smells that others detect and helps us communicate basic subconscious info without even talking. Or in other words, we like to sniff people out when we first meet them. Literally. So next time you meet someone new and you have an almost automatic urge to reach out and shake their hand to greet them, just remember, you might be sniffing them, and they might be sniffing you too. Weird, right?
Saturday morning. The perfect time for friends, snacks, and video games. But did you ever stop to think who actually invented the two magical days we call the weekend? Let's find out on today's episode of
Colossal Questions.
We might take our weekends for granted these days, but did you know they've been around for less than 100 years? That's right. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the idea of a two-day weekend was first considered. This was during a period known as the Industrial Revolution, when jobs started shifting away from traditional farming and agricultural work and towards jobs in large factories. Many workers were unhappy with their new jobs since the factories had them working long hours every day, and sometimes even forced them to work 7 days a week. As more and more workers complained about the terrible conditions, organized labor strikes formed across the US. But it wasn't just strikes that led to the invention of the weekend. Many Jewish and Christian workers would ask for Saturdays or Sundays off in order to rest for the traditional day of worship. Over time, owners realized it would be easier to let workers off on both Saturday and Sunday. So that's where the idea started. But one man in particular was responsible for turning the weekend into an official part of the work week. The man behind Ford Motor Company played a big role in creating our weekend. Ford began giving his factory workers a two-day weekend in the early 1900s. Why did Henry Ford decide to do this? Why, for cynical business reasons, of course. He realized that some of his best customers were his employees. So, if he wanted to sell more cars, he decided his factory workers needed time off each week to enjoy them. It wasn't until 1938 that the federal government jumped on board, limiting companies to the 40-hour work week that we still have today. So, the next time you're lounging on the weekend, you can thank labor unions, religion, and Henry Ford for understanding that everyone's happier if people have a couple of days off each week to buy things and enjoy life.